Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws. This is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, the NBA season is done. It is in the books. Another one is finished, and the Oklahoma City Thunder are your 2025 NBA champions, pulling off a Game 7 win, 103-91, with SGA winning the Finals MVP, right? Averaging over the course of the Finals 30 points, 4.5 rebounds, 5.5 assists, 1.9 steals, 1.6 blocks. To kind of cement his season as one of the all-time great individual seasons for a player, one of only the handful of guys to win a scoring title and the MVP and the championship all in the same season. So hats off to him. First of all, do want to shout out and have some prayers out for Tyrese Haliburton, because in the game, if you hadn't have already seen it and hadn't already been known by now, which you probably have, he did tear his Achilles in that game, right? Tried to gut out a calf injury through the last few games, and in Game 7 hit some big shots to kind of give the Pacers an early lead, and it kind of made you believe, oh, the Pacers have a real shot at winning this thing. And then unfortunately he does tear his Achilles. He's not able to come back in the game, and once that happened, you kind of knew that Indiana was going to have a really tough time. And even then, it was still a competitive game for the first half, but just didn't have enough in the second half, right? It kind of ended up having to become TJ McConnell trying to bail them out. He did have an individual scoring run, but there were also a lot of turnovers. Siakam, Nembhard, Nesmith, all those guys, right? And this is what makes Haliburton such a special player and a superstar, right? Where all those guys, once he was gone, you just didn't have enough, because he's kind of the guy that puts everything all together. But either way, Indiana had a very memorable, special championship run. But obviously, as for Oklahoma City, right, they had a great run as well, right? I believe they were tied for most wins if you combine regular season and playoffs, right? They went 68-14 in the regular season. Then in the playoffs, they went 16-7. So, 84 wins over the course of the season. Mm-hmm. So obviously, the 21 losses, it puts them, I think, record-wise for regular season and playoffs, a tier under some of the top teams, right? I believe the 96 Bulls and a few other teams got to that 80-plus wins with only a handful of losses. But either way, one of the youngest teams to win it all, youngest team in the league. And they did it all with the identity of the defense, right? Even though their offense was really good in the regular season, they were one of the best three-point shooting teams in the regular season. When you go into their playoff stats, their three-point shooting in the playoffs was a sight to behold, and honestly not in a good way, right? Actually, if you want to talk about the regular season, where were they? I believe they were 5th in terms of three-point percentage, right? They were pretty good. But then obviously, come playoff time, it really dropped off. But either way, the thing that helped out was, like I said, the defense. If you actually want to get to the actual percentages, in the regular season, they shot 37% from three, sixth best in the league, right? And then in the playoffs, it dropped like a rock. It dropped all the way down to 34%, which was, I believe, 13th of the playoff teams. So they were one of the 5 worst three-point shooting playoff teams in the league. Meanwhile, the Pacers were 39% from three in the playoffs, which was actually the best three-point percentage. They were they were 9th in the league in three-point percentage. So their three-point percentage went up, whereas Oklahoma City's dropped. And that's kind of a key thing with Oklahoma City, where it's funny because when we talk about, the complaints over the course of the season, where a lot of these teams play the same and they don't really look that much different, not a lot of variety. Oklahoma City actually, was very different from what we've seen from a lot of these championship teams, because, with a lot of these teams, they either have the profile of being a really good three-point shooting team in the modern era, or the three-point percentage just gets better in the postseason, right? Maybe they get hot. Like the Lakers when they won the title. Regular season, they were kind of a mediocre three-point shooting team. They weren't really that good. But then you fast forward into the playoffs, and then all of a sudden Anthony Davis is hitting threes from basically everywhere, right? Just kind of a crazy phenomenon that you see. The Nuggets, right, were not like a super high volume three-point shooting team, but they ended up in the playoffs, right, seemingly hitting every shot. But for Oklahoma City, it was the complete opposite, where 3-point wise, they could not hit at all. And in some of these games, they were able to generate some quality looks, but they just never really went down. Maybe some of that's the defense, just because it takes a lot out of you to play defense the way that they do, because there's no other team that defends like they do, right? They were a supremely dominant defensive team. That third quarter showed you why. And in even some of the other games in the series, just long stretches where they'd force Indiana. And even if you go back to the earlier rounds, all those games where teams just can't stop turning the ball over against them, with all these guys that are physical, that get into the passing lanes, play super hard. It's super tough to score on them, and the Pacers gave them all that they could handle. But, in the end, Oklahoma City showcased why what they did during the regular season showcased that they were a championship level team. And we were high on them. We both had them making the finals. We didn't have them winning the title, but we knew that going into this season that the hype that they had coming off their regular season last year was warranted. We figured that we believed in the growth and the success of the individual players on the team. Obviously, there were other questions. Could Jalen Williams be the second best guy on a championship team? Was Chet Holmgren ready to kind of come into an expanded role? All these other young guys, could they be viable pieces as well? But then you also look at the offseason acquisitions they made. Isaiah Hartenstein and Alex Caruso. Caruso especially, right, in the postseason, changed a lot for them. They don't win the title without his contributions. He had a number of big games, even in these finals, right, where he changed the game for them. I mean, you go into the last few rounds where there's stretches where he's guarding Jokic. There's stretches where he's guarding Ant-Man. There's stretches where he's guarding Julius Randle. And then, in this one, just some of the offensive things, because the funny thing for him was he was actually one of the handful of guys where in the playoffs he actually shot better from three for Oklahoma City than he did in the regular season. And it felt like so many of his shots were timely. He shot 41% from three on 4 attempts a game. And, he made a bunch of big shots, especially in that game 4. And that's the one where, if you're Indiana, that's the one where you kind of look back and you're like, man, that probably cost us the series right there, right? Because they had a chance to go up 3-1. And Caruso on the road, obviously SGA is the big guy, the big factor, because he had the huge game where he had the 10 points or individually in the fourth quarter to get Oklahoma City back into the game when it looked like they were going to lose. But Caruso had a 20-point game in that game. So, that's where kind of the veteran experience comes in there. But Oklahoma City showcase, this is not your typical young team. For the franchise, right, they had such a quick turnaround because they were only bad for a couple of seasons, right? Whereas we've seen some of these other teams be bad for years and years and years before they win a title. Or you have some other teams that are good for years and years and years, but not able to get over the hump, right? We saw the Denver Nuggets were a playoff team pretty much every year since, I don't know, 7 years or so?
Yeah.
They've been in the playoffs for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And, their first title was a couple of years ago. So for Oklahoma City, organizationally, they've done everything the right way. They made the big gamble of, well, not gamble, but they traded all their guys away, the initial stars, Paul George and Russ, got back assets, including SGA. And that Paul George trade also netted them future picks, including Jalen Williams. And then obviously their own pick, they had Chet Holmgren. And they've been able to put together a special championship team. And for SGA, right, a special championship player where, we've talked about it this season, and we said it on the live stream the other night, if you want to check that out as well, where he's kind of Mr. Consistency, where how many times do you look up and, you'll be like, oh, well, it didn't feel like he played that great, and he still had 28 plus, 30 points a game. How many times have we seen him this season have a game where he has less than 20? Hasn't happened a lot. And it's not just the scoring. In this game specifically, the thing that was so impressive was decision making and playmaking, because in game 6 he had 8 turnovers, which was his worst game in terms of just throwing the ball away. A lot of that was great Indiana defense, but then there were also some passes where it's just kind of, what are you doing? But in this game, he made a much more concerted effort to not have that happen again. Only 1 turnover in this game to 12 assists. And it's funny because he had a bunch of assists in the first half, but it felt like Oklahoma City was struggling outside of SGA. He had 7 assists at halftime. And you're kind of thinking like, well, there's no one else on the team that really has, that's in double figures, right? Caruso was the second highest leading scorer in the first half with 8. And he had some shots where the defense was collapsing on SGA, and SGA was able to kick it out and find the open man. And he could have had more assists if some of these guys had made more shots. And there were a lot of possessions at different points where it kind of felt like we don't know what we're going to do, reset and give the ball to SGA. And that's where it was super impressive for him to have the game that he had. He shot 8 for 27. I don't really care because of the fact that, so many of those shots were kind of when the game was decided already. And they needed him to have one of those type of games where, he's not afraid, he's super aggressive, and, the ball's in his hands, making a lot of the decisions because, we've seen some of the offensive limitations of this team. But we did talk about, in terms of some guys that needed to show up, Chet Holmgren, 18-8 with 5 blocks. We said you needed him to have a big game on both ends of the floor, especially on offense, in order for them to have a chance to come out of here alive. Jalen Williams was kind of absent, disappeared, or was a ghost in the first half, but in the second half showed up because it was a 1-point game, 1-point Indiana lead to begin the second half. And everyone else chipped in at different points. Cason Wallace, who was bad for most of the finals, right? Had a big game 7. Caruso, of course, had some big moments there too. And it's funny because the depth for Oklahoma City, they were down to basically 7 guys by this point. Like Wiggins played 12 minutes, but really, when you look at Oklahoma City, this was a game where big SGA game, you needed the other guys just to show up on both ends of the floor, and they did. And now they're in the pages of NBA history where they are NBA champions. They don't count the Seattle title as part of their franchise history. So this is basically their first franchise title. And we'll see where Oklahoma City goes from here, right? Because of the fact that we've talked about this from the last several NBA champions, and we've made the case for each one to go back to back, and it hasn't happened. We'll see if they're the first ones to do it. They have a strong case to be set up for the future because they're young. A lot of their core guys are only going to get better. They will have financial flexibility for at least another season. And, they have some new guys coming in. Nikola Topic, he could be potentially like another extra ball handler that they need, where you see it and they don't have a lot of that. And there's just some natural growth from some of these other guys. Some of these rotational pieces will be in and out. But just shout out to Oklahoma City for having, for capping off a regular season with a great postseason run. Had a lot of drama, had a lot of tension, had a lot of moments. Weren't sure if they were going to get out alive, but they did, and they got the title. And for them, it's looking great for them.
Yeah,
We'll see where they go
for sure. And going back to going into the postseason, right? You and I both were under the firm belief that nobody in the West could, take Oklahoma City in 7 games. You could take them there, but not, beat them in a 7-game series. And look what happened. They won the title, and shout out to them. Each player has confidence, in each other, right? And I think that's the cool part, right? I don't think we've ever really seen a team this young be so mature, right? And, you credit the vets and, the pieces that they did bring in the offseason, but I think it truly does start at the top with Shea, obviously J-Dub as well, and Chet, right? Like the confidence that those guys have, the confidence that the coaching staff has in those guys, right? They're a responsive team. If they have a bad game, all right, cool. They're not going to have 2 in a row, right? They're going to figure things out. They're going to figure it out and respond in the best way possible, right? And you talked about it. The counting stats didn't look great for Shea, but look at his response, right? He was turned into a playmaker, right? A guy who was making solid reads, a true offensive hub. And like you said, J-Dub, quiet, but when they needed him, he showed up, right? There were times when Shea quite literally deferred to J-Dub, and I think that's awesome, right? When the MVP of the league is deferring to you, right? I think that's a huge confidence boost for him. And that's what I'm talking about, where it's like the little things like that. You don't really see that on some of these other teams that are true contenders like Oklahoma City, right? So, I think character kind of puts them above a lot of other teams as well, but the personnel definitely helps, right? They're stacked from head to toe. A lot of guys that didn't play would definitely be playing, on other teams as well. So they truly are stacked. They're definitely set up for the future. You've got a great young core, a young big 3, and yeah, once again, they delivered anytime you asked them to. It wasn't pretty, right? It wasn't perfect, but they still did it.
Right.
And that's the cool thing about it, right? We've seen young teams be in this situation before and they just couldn't get over the hump because of, external factors, not showing up, disappearances, whatever the case may be. But culmination is the cool part about this, right? Like everything that they've done throughout the postseason has led up to this point, right? Like imagine the J-Dub 40-point game doesn't happen, right? Then
Right.
it's a completely different ball game. Maybe they still win, maybe not. You never know, but the conversation would be completely different. So it's things like that that continue to add up. Like you said, the Shea 10-point takeover, Caruso having those great games, Chet even in this game, having the 5 blocks, being efficient on both ends of the floor is just phenomenal to really watch, and it's a true machine for sure. And I think they're set up for the future. Maybe not a dynasty. I know we bring that up pretty much every time a new team does win the title because that's what it really feels like, right? A lot of these teams seem to be set up for the future, right? Like you look at Boston last year, you would have thought, well, yeah, the core is going to remain the same. All that matters is really health, and look what happened. Health kind of destroyed that team a little bit. So now I think we're kind of looking at Oklahoma City probably the same way. It's just a matter of, what do they look like next season? Because a lot is not probably going to change, right? They're probably not going to change much at all, except for add in a couple of guys into the rotation, like you said, Topic. But yeah, offensively, defensively, coaching wise, you just love everything that they've been able to do. And yeah, shout out to Shea as well for having an all-time season, man. It's rare. He's in elite company and well deserved for sure.
Yeah, I mean, for him as an individual, right? This season, right? MVP in the regular season, 33, 5, and 6. And, we kind of said last year where we felt like last year he had shown that he's a legitimate playoff guy, right? Because, when in his previous stops, like you saw flashes. Now, obviously he wasn't in this tier of player, but he didn't, you like when he was a Clipper, right? He had some games in the playoffs where you could see some flashes. When he was in Oklahoma City, playing next to Chris Paul, he saw flashes. But then obviously, the last couple of years, he's, each year, the last several years, he's taken his game to another level. And it's funny, right? Because like I said, with Oklahoma City, they profile as a different championship team from a lot of these other ones, right? It's very unique because they're super young. They didn't have a lot of experience going in, right? I mean, even the most experienced players were not necessarily, star level guys, right? It's Caruso. And, after that, everyone else, right, had been kind of second round at best, for the most part. And then the 3-point shooting, right? And that's kind of the thing that is the funny part because we all kind of felt like, yeah, in the modern NBA, you got to be a really good 3-point shooting team if you want to be able to go far. And in the regular season, they were, but not so much in the postseason. And even SGA, right? In the playoffs, he shot 28% from 3, right? Which, was well below his regular season average. Even in the finals, he only shot 24% as a team. Oklahoma City shot 34.5% from 3, which is actually a little better than what they shot over the course of the whole postseason. But, like we mentioned, that defense is just stifling. And that's kind of the thing that teams have to figure out how to solve over the course of a 7-game series. And nobody was able to figure it out because the funny thing is that this may have been your best chance to take out a healthy Oklahoma City team because of the fact that you expect them to continue to be better. Maybe, who knows? Maybe they don't win 68 games next season. Maybe it's like 65 or 62 or whatever. I don't know. But regardless, you'd expect them to, at least on paper, be better because to me, a lot of the warts that they can solve are mainly at the offensive end. And I think some of that will just come with some of these guys getting better, getting more comfortable, continuing to play alongside one another. Because it did because that's kind of where a lot of this reared their ugly head. There weren't a whole lot of games like the defense just isn't there today, right? Even aside from Game 6 against the Pacers, a lot of the previous games they lost, right? You felt like a lot of them was just like the offense was just disgusting, which is the wild part because you don't usually feel like, a team is just flat out bad on one end of the floor when they win the title. But there were a lot of nights in the postseason where it got ugly, especially on the road. But at home, that was where you saw a lot of the dominance from Oklahoma City, right? Because they only lost 2 home games in the postseason, and they came literally on game winners.
Yeah.
right? Where in both of those games they controlled most of the game. But now, like I said, now they've cemented their status as a great team, one of the great teams in the NBA.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is due. And again, defense we know wins championships, and that was kind of their identity over the course of this season. So I can't wait to see where they continue to grow. But I think the main growth is going to be on the offensive end of the floor. And again, they're set up for a lot of future success because we know Chet and J Dub will get paid. Their contracts won't be in effect until the following offseason, I'm pretty sure. And then SGA, obviously, he'll get his big supermax contract. That might be the point where once you combine that with the other two contracts, where it may be tough to keep the squad together. We know the new CBA is kind of built in that way to kind of prevent or limit how long teams can continue to stay competitive with a specific core. But, right now we're in the present, and that's kind of where you have to take it all in and just kind of, be impressed by what Oklahoma City was able to do. I know there's conversations that some people have had about, some other things, but I feel like that happens every year, right? Where you just kind of get, some negative conversations, recency bias, and all that. And by the time we go on to the next season, a lot of it goes away anyway. So if you're an Oklahoma City fan, you take this and you celebrate it,
Yeah.
and don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
For sure, man. That's how it normally goes. There's always, weird, stupid discourse, hating. And the funny thing is, I feel like it started for this team very early, right? Like earlier than other teams, right? Like, because I feel like the Celtics, right? We didn't really get that until they kind of started knocking out opponents. But with the Thunder, we got that before they even got to the playoffs, right? There was like a growing, I guess, like hate around this team, which is kind of interesting because it's very unusual.
Last
But
year was loved.
yeah, exactly. It's weird, but the flip flop is nuts.
Yeah, the Celtics one, I feel like there were always people who were just not going to like that team anyways, just because
Sure,
it's the Celtics. I mean, I'm a Laker fan, so
sure.
I wouldn't root for the
Me
Celtics. But
neither. Yeah.
then I guess there was also the discourse around Tatum and all that. But this isn't necessarily the podcast of the discussion for all of that, but it
Mm-mm.
is out there, so
Yeah.
it's something worth talking about. But from a Pacers perspective, if you're a Pacers fan, this has got to feel awful
Right.
because it's one thing to have this team that you've seen over the course of the entire season, right? All the ups and downs, all the drama, and everything else. And they ended up getting all the way to the NBA Finals, and they force a game 7 and look like they have a real chance to steal it. And then Tyrese Haliburton tears his Achilles. And that's the worst part of it is that, obviously he had the calf injury. We have seen in the past, right? The worst case scenario of these. We saw it with Kevin Durant, where, he comes back. He had already, I mean, because he had sat out for, I think, a few weeks with that calf injury when he was in Golden State his last year there. Then he comes back for that do or die Warriors game in game 5, I think, when they were down 3-1.
Mm-hmm.
And he plays 10 minutes or so and then tears his Achilles. And then, he's out down and out for the next season. It takes him basically 2 years to get back. And, that's the brutal part of this postseason where this was kind of one of the best seasons that I can remember, as an NBA fan in, recent memory. Not that the last few seasons were terrible, but just this one had so many awesome things going for it. Some great teams, a lot of great individual games and performances, a lot of great storylines, some big trades. Then, of course, the postseason happens, and we had some great playoff games and matchups, upsets, all-time great performances by some of these guys and teams. And then some of it just feels so marred by injuries. We got 3 guys, right, who tore their Achilles this postseason. Dame, Tatum, now obviously Tyrese Haliburton, and now you got multiple franchises where their team's future is in some real doubt right now. Because if you're the Pacers, um, again, you were 1 game away from winning the title, and now you're further away than you ever were. Well, not ever, but you're further away than you were
Mm-hmm.
because now you have a whole setback where your best player, your franchise guy, your superstar. I think pretty much any concerns or doubts about him being a superstar has to go away at this point when you get this far in the playoffs and when you see how the team in the second half looked without him. But now he's going to be out for presumably most, if not all, of next year. And now the Pacers, right, don't even really get a chance to potentially make it back to the finals. And we know how difficult it is to get to the finals, let alone win it, right? Because
Yeah.
for both of these teams, there's a chance where the other doesn't win it and then they don't get back. I mean, we expect Oklahoma City to continue to be really, really good, but there's still no guarantees because you have to be healthy and everything else that comes with it. And for the Pacers, yeah, you can run it back with this roster, but it won't be the same because you're going to be without Tyrese Haliburton. And that's the awful part where, now I don't want to say their window's closed, but obviously for the next year, right, they're not going to be able to have a good chance at getting back. Same with the Celtics. The Celtics were able to cash in with their title. And again, that's why you always cherish the title when you get it, because you may not get another one. And, one title alone is amazing.
Yeah.
But, now for the Pacers, they have a lot of questions to answer and figure out now, but it starts, mostly with their franchise guy where, when will he be able to come back? How long will it take before he can look like the same guy that we saw? And, he's still getting ready to enter the prime of his career. And, now we have to wait a while for the Achilles, kind of like the just like the Tatum situation. So that's a brutal part where had that not happened and they had lost anyways, you might be talking about, all right, maybe they can make some changes on the roster on the fringes, re-sign Miles Turner, bring him back, maybe find a okay backup center or hope that Isaiah Jackson comes back. Maybe you get some more Jarvis Walker minutes. What do you do with Mathurin? But all that is in the background now because of the Haliburton injury. And that's the part that is such a bummer for this series and for the postseason as a whole, was just all the injuries that occurred. And it continues to highlight just, how tough it is to win a title, especially in the modern era where we have not had a team go back to back in 7 years. And even the team that wins the title doesn't even get back to the finals. They don't even get to the conference finals. Usually it's the second round is kind of the max, and then they tap out because they just don't have it to go further than that. And so that's where, if you're the Pacers and if you're a Pacers fan, like I said, that's just awful, just a brutal thing to witness and go through. Like I said, to come so close and now, you have a major setback. So hopefully, I'll be optimistic and I'll believe that he'll come back at some point and he'll be the same guy that he was before. But, it's going to hurt. And like I said, that game 4 that the Pacers had and weren't able to hang on, that's the one that's going to stick for a long time.
Yeah, I feel for Pacers fans like immensely, man. Like the Halliburton injury is just that was really a tough watch, right?
Of
And
course.
I it's tough to really figure out where they go from here, right? Like you do have to wait on that injury, and hopefully, he doesn't rush it or anything like that, right? Like he takes as long as he needs
Right.
to feel like he's 100%, or at least close to the version that we saw this year, right? And that's all you can really do. And I think they'll be a good team next year without him. Like I think they won't be this good, but I think they'll be like a solid playoff team, right? And I don't think they need to adjust, too much because they have depth, right? They do have depth. They do have, strength in numbers, and I think that's something good that they have going for them. But clearly, they're not the same team without him, and I think that's going to really rear its head next year, unfortunately. But you have to shout them out. No matter what, because not a lot of people picked them to be here, if anybody. We personally picked against them in every single series, which is wild. And they completely, got to the finals. But they just couldn't get over the hump. And it's a tough ask because look at how overpowered Oklahoma City is, right? That team is stacked from top to bottom. But Indiana, they showed us that it's possible to take them to 7. So if you can take them to 7, then you can beat them eventually, right? Somebody's gonna probably do it at some point and figure it out. But shout out to Indiana because they gave us, upset after upset, stellar performance after stellar performance, against some pretty good teams. So, yeah, I mean, if you're a Pacers fan, my prayers go out to you, man, because that was heartbreaking to watch.
Yeah, that's one of the worst experiences you can have as a sports fan for sure. And we'll see where they go from here. But, now that kind of opens the question of, the Eastern Conference as a whole. And, I guess before we get to the Durant stuff, we can talk a little bit about where a lot of these other teams will go from here. And, what lessons can we kind of learn from what we saw from these two teams in the playoffs? Because these two teams essentially were the two best teams in the league, pretty much. and they showed, they were literally about even for the entire series up until, the Haliburton injury in this game. And, what did you see, I guess, from both of these teams that you feel like maybe some other teams can kind of take and absorb and learn going forward? Or are these two teams kind of just their own teams and there's no real way you can really replicate the things that they do?
No, you can replicate it for sure. It comes down to roster construction, right? They do have some things going in their favor, right? Like Oklahoma City, I think we should start with them. You do have two young stars that are on rookie deals, right? So, that gives you a ton of flexibility in terms of who you can surround, the entire team with, right? But I think number one would be the double big, right? I think that was so successful for Oklahoma City during the regular season. We didn't see it as much in the postseason, specifically really the finals, but it still gives you a lot of switchability, versatility on both ends of the floor, right? And I think teams are probably going to try and adopt that, right? And I think you saw that was
Yeah.
kind of a weakness that Indiana had at times, but they had a great strength in terms of depth, right? And I think that's another thing where teams are probably going to start prioritizing depth over, front loaded teams with tons of top end talent, right? You're going to want strength in numbers at this point, just to give your guys fresh legs. And it goes back to the switchability, versatility thing as well, right? You kind of want to replicate, what Indiana was able to do in terms of their bench, like very very strong bench unit, a little up and down at times, but when they needed to deliver, they kind of did that, except for Game 7, right? And even like a guy like T.J. McConnell, like constantly being that second unit floor general, that was a huge thing. So I think teams are probably going to be looking at acquiring like a real playmaker to command the bench, and then obviously big man depth, right? Like I think the big man position is totally back, and I love that, right? Because you can have so many different kinds of big men, right? You can have stretch bigs, you can have just pure old school bigs, rebounders, right? But at the end of the day, I think teams are probably going to want to replicate exactly what Oklahoma City did with their two bigs in Hardenstein and Chet, right? Where it just gives you so much more flexibility in terms of what you can do on both ends of the floor. So that's kind of what I learned. And then obviously, like, the superstar factor is always going to be a thing, right? If you want to contend, you have to have, a top 10 guy, right? And I think that's the beauty in it. So hopefully, teams will kind of continue to build around their superstars, because I think everybody can get to that level, right? If they have the right personnel around them. It's just a matter of, getting those guys and what does that look like. But I think it truly does start with that double big.
Right. And that's the thing where we talked about, like, say with the Pacers, they built their team around the strengths of Tyrese Haliburton. And, they were able to put together an awesome team, right? That was, where all these guys complement him. They're all willing to run the floor and play hard, and be physical and everything else. Of course, you got the two-way abilities there, guys who can space the floor. I mean, of course, we talked about them offensively where they weren't even that reliant on the three at different points over the course of the season, where they have guys in the mid-range and everything. I guess the number one priority outside of Halliburton, of course, in terms of, him recovering is, I guess, if you're the Pacers, is bring back Miles Turner, right? Now, he didn't really have a great series, right? Especially on the offensive end, but just as a whole, he was very important to what they do on both ends of the floor. So I don't really see a real reason, to not bring him back. And that's not really a hot take or anything. It's just, I know that there's, discourse on it now because he did have a rough postseason. But as a whole, I don't see, I think he comes back anyways. Obviously, some people will question of, well, how important is it for them to go into the tax now that next season will probably be a lost season? But I still think you might as well bring back Miles Turner, run it back. And some of these other guys, maybe they'll have more opportunities. It sounds like a positive. It's not really because of the injury, but maybe some of these guys with expanded offensive roles and more minutes, maybe they'll have chances to do something by the time Haliburton comes back. We'll see. But that's probably the main thing for Indiana. Because again, like, most of these other guys are on long-term deals anyways. Like, Nembhard, Nesmith. I'm sure they'll be up for extensions at some point. But, for now, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with
you. Yeah, and then I guess we can look at it from the two conferences out as well, where if you're in the Eastern Conference, you're looking at this and the East feels wide open right now, right? Because obviously the Pacers, they just went to the finals and they're Probably not going to go back to the finals next season, unless Haliburton beats all the odds and comes back early and is just like himself. And even the Celtics, right? We don't know when Tatum's coming back, if he even comes back at all next season, right? Those were kind of the last two teams to make the finals in the Eastern Conference.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're the Cavs or if you're the Knicks, right? There's no real reason to blow those teams up because, some people thought maybe the Cavs should blow it up. Even before this, we didn't think they should. But, now if you're the Cavs, I mean, you did have a 60-win regular season. You got embarrassed in the playoffs by the Pacers. But you might as well run it back. Hopefully you stay healthy and see what you can do from there. And if you're the Knicks, probably a similar thing. They're going to have to get a coach. I don't know if they'll make any significant changes to their roster, because Giannis doesn't seem like he's on the block right now. I don't really think that there's anyone else that they're going to be going after. Durant got traded. We'll talk about that soon. And then if you're the Magic, I mean, you just made a big trade where you got Desmond Bane for KCP and Cole Anthony and picks. And if they're healthy, they're not going to be favored or picked to come out of the East, but they should be better, right? They should at least get past the first round if they're healthy, right? And then Detroit will still be hanging around. We'll see if they're any better. So, but, and then even if you're the Bucks, right? That's kind of the argument right now to not trade Giannis is, again, they're not going to have Dame, but they should still be at least a playoff team, and they'll see where that goes. And then, I guess if you're looking at the rest of the Eastern Conference, even the Hawks, right? They're a team where before the Jalen Johnson injury, they were really good. So, maybe they could make a push for, the conference finals, and maybe if they get
that was
hot,
going to
who
be my
knows?
pick. That was going to be like a hot take pick that I had. Like, I think they're
Right.
probably primed to potentially come out of the East, but could be
Right.
wrong.
So, so that's the thing. And honestly, I know you might hate hearing this. Philadelphia 76ers.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, that's another one.
if they can actually have a healthy season, with Embiid, with Paul George, whomever they draft, if they even use that pick at all, they should make the case. Why not them?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it, but there's no real
When
reason
healthy,
to
they're scary for sure. But
Right.
are they going to be healthy?
Yeah. Right. So that's the problem there. So so in the Eastern Conference, that conference is wide open.
Yeah.
And so if you're an Eastern Conference team, if you have any belief in your main guy, of course you don't want to do anything dumb. You don't want to do anything stupid. But just as a whole, if there's a good deal out there, you might as well push your chips and see what you can do with your core guys. Because, especially like I said, a team like Atlanta where you have Trae Young, you have Jalen Johnson, you have Dyson Daniels, you already have these guys that, have kind of shown that they're really legitimate, right? They're a little bit further, Ricochet, they're a little bit further along with some of these guys than maybe some of these other teams. Or if you're the Magic, you have Paolo, you have Franz, and now you have Bane. So see what you can do. See if you can make a push in the Eastern Conference. Same with Cleveland. So the Eastern Conference is going to be a battle next year. And, again, probably ask any analyst. I'm sure we'll probably see a bunch of different teams that will be picked to come out of the Eastern Conference. But conference finals, at the very least, I think should be a realistic goal for pretty much almost any good team in the Eastern Conference, I would say.
I agree with you. And
then if you move out into the West, obviously Oklahoma City looks like the big bad team. I wouldn't necessarily say they're 100% unbeatable because we just saw them go through 2 7-game series this postseason. They could be better next year, so maybe they do become unbeatable. But I wouldn't necessarily feel that way. I mean, if you're the Rockets, again, we'll talk about that. We'll probably talk about that next. They made that big push, the big trade to go out and get Kevin Durant. Of course, all these other teams are kind of clustered together after Oklahoma City. So, why not make some big moves?
Yeah, for sure. I think the teams that I kind of have my eye on, obviously Oklahoma City. I would say Houston is another one. Minnesota, that's another one. And I think this one might be hot takey, but San Antonio, who knows? I don't know what they look like, using the number 2 pick, but a fully healthy Wembanyama, fully healthy Fox, all the other role players. It doesn't seem like they're taking a big swing at a superstar or anything like that, or another star to add on to that. So internal development as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if they could potentially take a big swing, and get to, I don't know, the conference finals or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is that again, it sounds like we're saying you're playing for second place, but again, you know, outside of Oklahoma City, right? Oklahoma City is one team. So in the conference finals, there's another team that they would have to face, and any of these teams could make a real reasonable case to make the conference finals. But for
Yeah,
some of them, I think they have to improve in order to have a decent shot
I
at
agree.
getting there, right? Like we just saw the Rockets improve. For the Wolves, Minnesota, right? If they don't make any significant moves and they just kind of bring guys back, then you're going to need internal development, right?
Hmm.
Like you're going to have to hope and pray that Rob Dillingham becomes, a real starting caliber point guard,
Sure.
right? Honestly, probably as early as next season, right? Because Mike Conley's not getting any younger, and he wasn't good against Oklahoma City,
Hmm.
right? He's archetype of player that would probably struggle a ton against that team, and we saw it, right? Older, not that athletic, no longer that quick. So that's what you're going to need from Minnesota. And then, for some of these other teams, like we saw, Golden State, Steph gets hurt. Maybe they get in there, right? LA, they don't have a center. They have Luca and LeBron. We'll see what they do. But yeah, I think for the Western Conference, I'm gonna be curious to see, what these teams do after Oklahoma City because it does feel like OKC is gonna be the prohibitive favorite. But I think we're still gonna see a lot of teams still push to make some moves because why not? Again, we just saw the Pacers go to the NBA Finals and challenge Oklahoma City for 7 games.
Yep.
So again, why not? Why not go for it? The worst thing you could do is just kind of be stuck and not have any real direction. Of course, there's always a danger of being like Phoenix, right? Which we'll get into and go all in. Now you're stuck. But, of course, that's why you do have to be measured in your approach.
Yeah, for sure.
So now let's get into the Kevin Durant trade.
Mhm.
So, of course, the morning of game 7, right, we had the blockbuster trade that sent Kevin Durant from Phoenix to the Houston Rockets for Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, the number 10 pick in the draft, which was actually Phoenix's pick, and then 5 second-round picks. So that trade, just as a starter, can't be completed formally until July 6th. So it's very possible that more teams could get roped into this. We'll see. Don't know right now. As of right now, there's not really been any further reporting on that. But the Durant trade saga is over. He's a Houston Rocket. This is the team that I think we believed of the short list of teams that he had, of the teams that were rumored as the most likely to get him. We thought this would probably be the best situation, the best team for him because of the fact that they need a player just like him on the offensive end of the. When we watched them in the playoffs, they didn't have a guy who could be a go-to offensive player, particularly from the perimeter. Because Şengün, you could go to him in the post, but even he had some weaknesses sometimes, right? Because he's not quite in the upper echelon of scores just yet. Maybe he gets there, but maybe he doesn't. But either way, outside of Jokic and Embiid and a handful of others, it's very difficult to have your go-to offensive guy be a big, just because you got to get him the ball. And there's just certain elements that you need some type of perimeter offense. And it's not Jalen Green anymore, who's, again, at times he can be very good, but he's also kind of inconsistent, right? We saw, some highs, game 2 against the Warriors, right? He had a great game, but for most of the series, he just wasn't quite good enough to be able to get you over the hump. Not his fault, right? Just kind of the construction of the roster. But we talked about it where once he got that extension, you knew, right? We knew that he was probably not bound for Houston long term because
Sure.
you never give a guy a rookie max extension, you know, 3 years, right? With the third year non guaranteed. And you're like, yeah, that's our guy. We believe in you, buddy. That was already the dead giveaway because Şengün got an extension as well. 5-year max extension, no questions asked, right? And so if you're Houston, I think this is just what the doctor ordered. Obviously, you can look at still some other holes in the roster, right? But either way, I think this is great for Durant and Houston because you got, like I said, you got a guy who can still play. Obviously, not quite the player he once was, but still a very good NBA player, right? Last season, he gave you what, 26, 6, and 4, still a 50-40, actually shot 84% from the line, which is, on the lower end for him, but still very good.
Yeah.
Because we saw Houston have some major problems at the line in the postseason, lost them a couple of games. But either way, that's a guy where we know. It's actually really funny because last year when we first had, right, the initial kind of rumors about, okay, Durant might be gone from Phoenix, Houston's going to be all in on him. They traded with Brooklyn to get those picks back that are Phoenix's, right? That Brooklyn got in the Durant trade, so Brooklyn could get their own picks back. And we were kind of skeptical at that time because at that time, most people, ourselves included, thought Phoenix had improved. We weren't quite high enough on them to pick them to win the title, but we thought this should be a 50-win team. They should at least have a shot. That did not happen at all. They were pretty bad, worse than last year. So bad that they fired the new coach, right? That they gave a 5-year deal to, and now they replaced him again, right? So not great from that perspective. But, now if you're Houston, you have a real guy you can turn to, and you still have the other young players, right? Like Amen Thompson, who showed some great signs in terms of his growth as a player, still needs to get, a reliable perimeter jump shot, but the foundation is there. We still saw what he can look like at his best, especially in the regular season. Jabari Smith Jr., I would assume now moves back into the starting five, right? Because he lost his starting spot to Thompson once Thompson emerged as a real guy. Because with Jalen Green and Brooks gone, that kind of opens up a spot there. And then Van Vliet, I'm going to assume he'll be back. Whether or not it's a team option that they accept or they just decline it and give him a new long-term deal, I don't know. But I'm going to assume he'll be back. And then that opens the door for Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore, who didn't really play as much for them in the regular season. And we'll see what they have. We'll see if they can be real rotational pieces for this team. But now this kind of propels them into the upper tier of the second tier of the Western Conference teams. Because right now it feels like OKC is in its own tier. We'll see if that holds. But it feels like Houston has moved closer and closer towards the high end of that second tier, where before you're like, okay, maybe if they get the right matchup, they could win a playoff series, but they probably won't. I mean, they pushed that Warriors team to 7. But now you feel more comfortable in that. Now they could win a playoff series. Maybe they could win 2. Maybe they could get to the conference finals and make a real push. In the regular season, they played well against Oklahoma. Of course, it's the regular season. We know now regular season matchups mean almost nothing for the most part. There's some takeaways you could have, maybe some schemes, but a lot of times it's just BS. But either way, I think this gets Houston closer. They re-signed or gave Udoka that extension. So I'm very curious to see how all these guys mesh and how they fit. Defensively, this should be way better than Phoenix because Houston's got a better defensive infrastructure. You did lose Dylan Brooks, who was one of their better defenders. But like I said, this should open up the door for more opportunities for Thompson, more opportunities for Jabari Smith. Van Vliet can still defend. We know this is a very good defensive team. Udoka's been a really good defensive coach, so I'm not really worried about that. I don't think you're worried about, the depth either, because with Phoenix, it was a very top-heavy roster. I don't think you feel that way about Houston. I think you feel like it's a more balanced, more evenly distributed roster. You just have to bank on some of those young guys getting better with the new opportunities that they will have. And then you just kind of go from there. And again, he's a guy we know Durant is an easy plug and play player. He's a guy that can fit pretty much anywhere, especially on the offensive end. He does have length defensively. Didn't play as good on the defensive end this year. How much of that is just defensive decline? How much of that is just the team was garbage defensively? How much of that was lack of effort once it became pretty clear that the team had no chance? Probably a mix of all of it, right? So I think in the playoffs, he can still be one of those guys that can help you. Even like I said, as we've seen, some lesser games from him in the postseason. But either way, I think this is great for Houston, where I think this helps get them closer to where they go. Nothing wrong with a deal like this. And they still have flexibility to post Durant if something happens. Maybe they could push their chips with some of these other guys and get somebody else to replace him. Who knows? But at least as of right now, the fact that you got Kevin Durant for, in my opinion, not much of a return, where it was just Jalen Green. That's really the only young guy in your core that you gave up. Yeah, Dylan Brooks, you did lose him. He's a good player. He had a really good year.
Yeah.
But you still have other guys that I think can kind of come in and help replace it. We'll see and it's Kevin Durant. So, you had to give up somebody in order to make the money work. Like I said, you didn't have to give up Jabari Smith Jr. Obviously, you weren't going to give up Amen Thompson or Şengün. So I think, best of both worlds. And the 10th pick, Who knows how much that guy would have played? They drafted Reed Sheppard third overall. He didn't really. Different draft, different players, different situation, but still. And they didn't even have to give up the picks that are Phoenix's, right? They didn't have to give up those either. Just, the 10th pick. I guess Phoenix got that back. So to me, that's a great deal. Miami didn't want to push, didn't push all their chips in. They didn't want to give up Jaquez and Jovic and the 20th pick. There's questions about how much better Miami would be. But, with the injuries in the East, it looks kind of worse now. Not that you'd pick them to win the East, but you'd expect them to be a good team. So that's rough for a team like Miami. And then from a Phoenix perspective, it's hard to say that you want to trade when you give up the superstar, right? And that's always kind of the tough part with this conversation. You got back Jalen Green, who again, not a perfect player, but he's a solid player, right? He did have a good year, and at least in the regular season, he could be helpful. Dillon Brooks, that's a 3-and-D guy. We know Phoenix struggled on the defensive end. And then the 10th pick, you get a lottery pick. Maybe you use it to draft a big. Maybe you do whatever. Now you're just building around Devin Booker. This is still a lottery team to me. So, I think they're kind of out of the conversation now of contenders. I guess for what was available, this was probably the best deal that they could do, right? Like I just, like the Miami deal, what were you going to get out of that? The Spurs clearly were not willing to give up, any of their picks. I don't think they were really willing to give up a ton for Durant anyways. And you were limited anyways, considering Durant had a short list of teams. So this is probably the best realistic scenario that could have happened for both sides. I'm curious to see what Phoenix does with Jalen Green. Do they keep him or do they trade him down the road? I don't know. But either way, obviously I like him more for Houston. Of course, there's questions and concerns. Kevin Durant, he's going to be 37. He has had problems at times staying healthy over the course of the regular season. We'll see. But to me, this is, if you're Houston, a no-brainer. And if you're Phoenix, you kind of had to deal Durant. Sucks that you didn't really get a whole lot back. And for Phoenix, it's brutal because just a few years ago, this team was in the finals and had a core that felt pretty sustainable, that felt like it could get better, that felt like it could make some moves on the margins. And, since that year, they've just gone on a downward trajectory. They have new ownership. Seems like a much better guy than the previous person, but it still feels like, there's just a little bit too much of some volatility there. And, now Phoenix is kind of back to the bottom again, in my opinion. I don't see that team really being very good this season. And even the best version of that team is still not a team that you're really thinking about a ton. This is more so a story about the Rockets and how, now they got, a real guy that can help them out for at least the next couple of seasons.
Yeah, from the Houston Rockets perspective, it's freaking amazing. And as a Durant fan, it's amazing too. It's really a match made in heaven in terms of the seamless fit, right? You're jumping onto a team that doesn't really have a superstar. You have a star in Şengün, and I think that fit is going to be cool to have a bunch of wings and a bunch of wing talent on a team like that, right? They have the length, they have the size, they have the defense as well. So it's really like I said, a match made in heaven, right? And I think Houston's probably going to be looking for 25 points on 50, 40, 90, typical Durant season, right? And I think you're probably going to get that. He might miss some time here and there, but I think you're probably going to be around 50 wins, if not more, right? But I think what they're looking for is postseason success, right? And that's what they want. Durant brings a ton of experience. He brings a championship pedigree. He knows the highs. He knows the lows as well of, what the playoffs can entail and bring, right? And I think that's going to be the beautiful part. We already know that his leadership, people don't understand it, I would say. But I think it's going to fit well within the culture of Houston, right? They're tough. They know what they want in a player. They have a pure identity. Like, we know what a Houston Rockets player looks like. And I think, KD being the superstar for that team is awesome, right? He's going to carry the load offensively. And a lot of the other guys, they'll fit in seamlessly, right? And you talked about it, right? They have depth pieces as well. You have a guy like Tyrese coming off the bench. You have Reed Sheppard. Yeah, exactly. Cam Whitmore, Reed Sheppard. Like, all these guys are going to, I think, come into their own around a guy like KD where, he's a scorer, but he's a smart scorer, right? He's not a shot chucker or anything like that. Like, and that's no shade to Jalen Green, but he just hadn't learned, I think, the ins and outs of the NBA. Like, we already know he's super talented, but look at KD and look at his experience, and his resume speaks for itself. And I think, if you're if you're Houston, this was an amazing deal for you, right? You didn't have to give up a whole lot. Like, I thought if Durant was going to come to Houston, it would have to be, the 10th pick. I think that was obviously going to be guaranteed to be in there. Probably Jalen Green and another, one of your young pieces, right? But the fact that you're able to, finesse that, and that's what it is. I really think it is a true finesse, right? Where you got Durant on a freaking bargain. Like that's pretty much on sale, if you ask me. And, for them, it's amazing because you get to keep most of your young core intact. You replace Jalen Green, who was very streaky at times in the playoffs, with a guy who's a certified bucket getter. So no complaints, I think, from the Houston perspective. And I think it's going to be fun to watch, for sure. And, Amon Thompson, that's going to be a big team. Like, think about it. You have Van Vliet at the 1, most likely, assumingly, right? Then you have exactly, and then you'd have Amon Thompson at the 2. Then like KD, Jabari Smith Jr. and Şengün.
Yeah.
Like everybody else outside of Van Vliet is 6'8" plus. That's scary to me. So you got a lot of potential. Exactly, you have a lot of potential with that team. So they're going to be definitely one of the teams that I'm watching for sure. Now, for Phoenix's perspective, I think I hate it. Like, I know you probably weren't going to net a whole lot in terms of getting Durant back, but the fact that the key piece that I like, and I said this on the live stream, the fact that the key piece that I like the most is Dillon Brooks is scary, right? That's not necessarily a good sign. I don't like the return that Phoenix got for KD. And like I said, you probably weren't going to get the treasure trove of picks or anything like that, or, supreme young talent. But now I think they have a wake-up call that they need to kind of refocus, right? You have Devin Booker, who can clearly be a, franchise guy and is a franchise guy, but they need to retool some stuff. They need to, I would say, get rid of all the other quote-unquote stars on the team, right? Like, you need to find a way to get rid of Beal, get some sort of, depth in terms of that in return for him, and you definitely need to get rid of Jalen Green. I don't think that those guys can coexist all together. There's no way I see that happening. I don't think that Phoenix would be dumb enough to go into the season with that kind of roster, but we've seen it before. So hopefully they reroute Jalen Green and get some depth pieces, maybe some picks down the line. I don't know, but they need to do something and switch that up because I'm not really a fan of that. But I do love Dillon Brooks. I think that's kind of the player that they do need to bring in, and they need to continue to kind of have guys like that in terms of 3-and-D wings, and really defense, right? I would prioritize that, and obviously get a big man. That's another thing as well. So they have a lot of work to do, but I guess this is a good first step. But even then, I'm really kind of disgusted with the returns.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I guess the first question is, do we think that this is the deal, or do we think that more teams get into this by the time July 6th rolls around?
I would hope that another team gets in and snatches Jalen Green up, and they give up a decent amount of something in return for him. That's what I would hope.
Yeah, and then I guess the question is, what are some teams where they would make sense to kind of grab him? Because
exactly.
Again, if you look around, a lot of the league, again, how many teams are kind of in the mode of, we'll take on Jalen Green.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of the question.
Right, that's kind of the question because, well, now the thing is for him, he's not a point guard, right? So obviously that's a lot different than, say when we were talking about like Darius Garland, right? Where I don't think he's not getting traded now, but just in general, right? That was kind of the tough part where it's like a lot of the best teams already have point guards, right? Green is more of a 2. So, that's not really the question there, but it's just I kind of struggle to look around and be like, yeah, like what team is kind of, looking to snatch Jalen Green? Like, because I'm looking at some of these teams, I'm kind of thinking like, when I'm looking like Utah, like maybe that's one. But, what is Utah giving up? Are they giving, what pieces are they giving to Phoenix that maybe Phoenix would want back, if any? Because they don't really have a center that I think, Phoenix would want outside of Kessler, but I don't think he's going anywhere.
Right.
And, he doesn't, money-wise, he doesn't make a whole lot. After that, Raptors, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they've kind of been in the mix for a lot of different guys, so maybe that's another team. And then after that, I don't know, Chicago maybe, but that's about it.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. It is a tough situation, but I would hope that they find some way to get rid of that because I just don't see that trio working out. Right? I don't know. That's just weird. 3 shooting guards. I don't think that would work.
Right, because that's I'm just saying like that's the tough part where I'm trying to figure out like where he
Yeah.
could realistically go. Unless you're talking about like we'll just have multiple two guards and we'll have the same problem, but over here like Brooklyn, I don't think would do that. Like we're gonna bring back Cam Thomas, then we're gonna have Jalen Green. I don't know if I don't think they're gonna do that.
No, they
So,
wouldn't.
but from Houston's perspective, it's a lot easier to figure out just because you're just looking at some of the young guys, like I said, continuing to elevate.
Yeah.
Probably add a couple other pieces in free agency. I don't. I don't. I think they're going to be a first apron team once July 6th rolls around, right? So I don't think they won't have the full MLE. I don't think, but they'll have the ability to probably bring in a couple of veterans.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess what other positions are we kind of looking at? Maybe if you're Houston, you'd like to add maybe like another 3-and-D guard. That's more like a natural shooting two. Maybe I mean a backup point guard potentially, but maybe that could just be Reed Shepherd. What else do you think that they might be missing?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's kind of what I was kind of zeroing in on. Maybe like another guard. Just maybe somebody who has a little bit more experience because that is a lot of pressure I think to put on a second-year guy. Granted, number 3 pick should be ready, but I don't know. It is weird. I would probably say a backup point guard or a 2 guard, just somebody who can kind of give you a little bit of offense off the bench. But you kind of already have that with Cam Whitmore. So maybe backup wing. I don't know. They could really just do anything that they want. They really could just pick their poison and be like, well, we could go after backup point guard, backup 2 guard, or backup 3, right? Because they've already got the big man. So yeah, I would probably say maybe like backup 2 guard.
Yeah,
That's what I would go with.
yeah, well, yeah. So like I said, I think they've done a really good job of again the way that they've kind of constructed their team over the last few years, where you kind of went from a team that looked like a mess, looked like a disaster, pretty rough foundation, and then they've improved every single year, got to the playoffs, 52-win season, first in a while, and now we'll see if they can do it again. I'd say win wise, again, the over unders at some point will come out, and we'll talk about those as we offseason teams and talks, but I'd expect them to probably be win wise around a similar record. Maybe you could make the case maybe they might win a few less, or lose a few more games, maybe because Durant misses X amount of time. But if you get that progression from the other young guys, that might be able to help you. Where in some of the games that he's out, you could still probably pull out the wins. We know, I'm sure the Western Conference, just like the last few years, will be super close in terms of the standings. But I think that the main thing that will help is some of the games that Houston kind of just blew and threw away because they couldn't close. That might help. So you could make the case maybe they might win a few more, right?
Yeah.
So that's
right.
and that's the benefit of getting a guy like Durant at this stage, even at the latter part of his career.
Yeah.
So now I guess to close it out, draft is literally in a couple of days. Obviously, round 1 is Wednesday. Round 2 is Thursday. Not really going to do a whole mock draft because that would take forever. But I guess the main thing is outside of course, the key top guys, are there any guys that you're looking at in the draft that you're kind of thinking might be sleeper picks? Might be guys where like if you're, I don't know, middle, lower part of the first round, or even maybe in the second round, maybe you might want to snatch up for your team and see what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, Trey Johnson, that's kind of a guy that I've had my eye on for a decent amount of time. I think he has a ton of star potential due to the fact that he's such a great shooter, right? And I think, the fact that he can create his own shot pretty much willingly, right? He's a great mid-range and three-point scorer, right? But the problem is it's the driving and the paint efficiency, right? That has a lot of room to grow. And at his frame, you kind of expect him to be a little bit better at that. He is 6'6", whatever, but that's definitely a guy that I think has a ton of superstar potential. So whoever picks him up, within that, beyond probably 3 to 10 range, yeah, they got one for sure. I think Jeremiah Fears looks solid. The tape looks good in terms of his playmaking and what he can do. I think he could potentially be molded into a great table setting point guard with some great scoring upside as well. So that would be cool to see, wherever he goes. I think Derek Queen, that's another one. I think, he's had a lot of negativity surrounding his his pre-draft process or whatever, but the tape is there, right? He's very old school, big, but he could be an offensive hub for sure. If you just give him the touches and surround him with the right personnel. So I think he could be definitely a sleeper as well. And to go later down the line, I think, guy like Jace Richardson, he's pretty underrated, right? And that's Jason Richardson's son. If you don't know, pretty cool. I think the lack of size might be an issue at that next level, but what he was able to do in college is pretty spectacular. So I'm sure that could translate, if he's in the right situation. What about you? Did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I like most of the ones that you kind of mentioned. I guess maybe if I'm kind of thinking maybe like an Asa Newell, that could be possibly
Okay.
like a decent, forward, 4 or 5 type guy.
Okay.
Maybe that could be picked up, but most of the other picks, I'm kind of with you where I think those are kind of a lot of the main guys. Maybe if you're looking at another big, maybe like Thomas Sorber,
Sure. Yeah.
that could be another possible player as well. Because for some of these teams, the free agency market for bigs is not going to be that great.
Yeah.
So for some of them, the only option to get a decent big, if it's not through trade, might be in the draft. So those are maybe some type of players that some of these teams may want to target.
Yeah.
Over maybe some of the other guards.
Cedric Coward, that's another one. I know his stock has been like booming recently, and I know it was a very small sample size in college, but what he did give us in college is pretty spectacular. Like if he played like that throughout the entire year, without an injury, then I think he would be guaranteed top 5, right? But his stock has exploded a lot. But I agree with you as well.
Yeah, and then I guess last but not least, do we have any predictions for how we think the draft might go? Do we think that there's going to be any? I mean, there's always at least one shocker surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have one that we think is going to happen?
I think one of the top 3 teams is going to trade back.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's going to be Philly. Not sure if it's going to be San Antonio. I know it's not going to be Dallas. If Dallas does that, then we're cooked as a universe.
Yeah.
But I would expect probably Philly to trade back and somebody to trade up to potentially get Ace Bailey. I know his stock has been falling, so maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, whatever the case may be. But I think Ace Bailey will be one of those guys that somebody wants to trade up for, especially if Philly's going to pass on him.
Yeah, I'm with you. I kind of expect that. That's what I would say. I think one of the top 3 is going to trade back, and I think we might see more trades this draft for sure than last year. Because last year I don't really think we had any aside from
the Rob Dillingham one.
Yeah, that one was kind of a shocker surprise. But outside of that, we didn't really have a ton. Aside from like the small ones, where like no, that was 2 drafts ago where we didn't really have any trades. Last year we did, but it was a lot of the late first and second round ones. That was where most of them came from.
Yeah.
Where it became a little bit hard to figure out. But there weren't really like shocking, surprising, big draft day trades aside from the Dillingham.
Yeah.
So I think we might have more. And then I guess just one last one. Do we have any other star players that we think get moved in the summer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like the only one that's really left right now that, has some steam to it would probably be Giannis, right? But do I expect him to get moved? Probably not. I think things might have calmed down for now. I think we kind of just have to wait till free agency, but I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm with you where it does kind of feel like, and again, nobody knows for sure, but at least as of right now, it does feel more and more like he may just stick around in Milwaukee, at least for now. Maybe he could get moved, later on. Like maybe he comes in next season and then they trade him closer to the deadline or something like that. And that's where, like, if you're some of these teams, like if you're the Spurs, that's why you just stand pat for now, because you never know. Something like that could pop up.
Yeah.
And, then you're towards the front of the line. So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
And now, like I said, one last thing before we get out, we did have a poll on IG who wins Game 7. Of course, it's all moot now because Game 7 is over, but it was actually 50-50. So people were split on the result of that one. And, for them initially up until Haliburton got hurt, definitely felt like a 50-50 coin flip game. So I think everybody who was in the poll was right on the money. Obviously, Oklahoma ended up winning it, but, up until the Haliburton injury, it was definitely up in the air. Even though we both picked Oklahoma City to win and we thought it would be close, it ended up not being close.
Yeah. I think that makes sense, 50-50.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Pretty much today's episode marks the end, the conclusion of the 2024-2025 NBA season. Now, of course, comes the off season. We're still going to have a bunch of content lined up for all of you. We're going to, hopefully talk about the draft and how that goes, talk about free agency and how that goes. Same with Summer League, all that. Keep an eye out for all of that content. If you want to get involved in these polls, just follow us on Instagram, on IG at the OBT Podcast. Of course, if you want to look at our other content on X or on TikTok, same thing at the OBT Podcast. If you leave a comment on any of our videos or any of our content, we'll pick one and read it. So, of course, if you want to get on that, leave comments as well. We appreciate all the support. We've gotten several new subs over the last couple of weeks, right? Hopefully, a lot of that's because of the finals and because people are interested in what we're talking about. And we appreciate all that. And we'll see you next episode or in the next live stream.